very selfish personal standpoint. My favorite actor, Warren Oates, is in the film, and I totally missed him on screen, so I was curious what film specifically you were pulling from for that.
Wait, which actor?
Oh, Warren Oates.
Warren Oates. It's that film, as you know, you're testing my terrible memory. Is it called Private Property?
Yeah, that's it.
There's a short moment from Private Property. It's a sequence where they're playing a record in the apartment.
Cool. Thank you. So this.
Please let that be the only test.
Yeah, no. It was like purely selfish, personal question. So this film is like, it draws from a lot of like the kinds of films that we show here at the Film Society. Probably has clips of films that we've actually screened. It looks pretty different from what you would normally see on screen here. It's a product of a lot of technologies that like have come much later than most of the materials in the film. So I thought maybe to sort of explain why it's this like collapsing of like close to, or more than 100 years worth of moving image technologies, both film and video. If you could sort of like walk us through the process of actually constructing this, going from films that were then digitized, edited digitally, and then put back to film.
Yeah, sure. I think the strange thing is, as much as the film is obviously a product of the fragments from which it's made, which are drawn from the first half of the 20th century for the most part, to me it's also as much, if not more so, a portrait of the current moment, in that the constraint I began with was the one I mentioned in the intro, that I wanted this to be a kind of collective cinematic space in which all of the figures who appeared were no longer alive. And so the second you're working with a constraint like that, it really is dependent on when you're making the film, because making it, you know, in this exact moment, I found that working with material post about 1960 became very difficult, because obviously films from that period onwards have a lot of living cast members, and it became quite tricky to kind of cut around them. And so the second I realised that, a certain kind of aesthetic was imposed on the film, a certain kind of, you know, the vast majority of the material I was working with was black and white. The vast majority was in the Academy ratio that the Afterlight is in. And so immediately, just from that constraint, a certain kind of feel started to impose itself. And yet, it's obviously a film that's being made in the present day, and the material that is available to me is a reflection of what from that earlier era has survived into the present day. And so even before I made my selections, which of course were loaded with my own biases and prejudices and personal taste, there were rounds of selection happening before I was even alive, based on what was looked after, what was preserved, and then of that pool of what's been preserved, what's been made available, the film was made without any kind of special access to archives, and so I was largely reliant on what had been put into the public realm, what had been made available commercially, and that obviously is hugely dependent on what archives and what distributors and the culture at large has decided has value, whether it's commercial value, cultural value. Often the two overlap because of, you know, who gets to make these sorts of decisions. And so, yeah, as much as it's a film that is kind of of the past in some ways, for me it's also one that is very much of the present. And it was edited digitally from this pool of material that has survived into the present day. And then as you say, put back onto the medium from which it all came, which was analog film. And for me, that felt like the closing of a loop, but also a very practical, material way to render what is one of the film's central concerns, which is the impermanence of all of this, the fragility of cultural memory and of what we choose to remember. And although, as you well know, and I'm sure would be the first to argue, digital cinema is no more stable than what came before. If anything, it's less stable and more prone to loss. It doesn't kind of wear that loss in the same way. And what I love about celluloid personally is the way that it wears the evidence of its own history, and how when you go and watch a print, you are seeing the marks, the scratches, the evidence of every other audience that's ever watched it before you, and the kind of the way that reflects this sort of collective forming of memory that we're all doing whenever we gather together like this and watch a film, for me is a really special thing. So while those different kind of processes might seem contradictory in some ways, for me they all have very specific resonances.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is really fascinating to think about watching this is that you have like preserved also a lot of these strategies for presenting old films digitally, like in the container of like a 35mm print. So you're seeing what are like very clearly like contemporary 4K restorations that have like totally been scrubbed and grain, and they're just like, they're gonna disappear in whatever 20 odd years, and there'll be some other new shiny like preservation technology out there. But like we have now this record of like what this like totally smooth like 4K look looks like, but it's on film now. And then that will look strange in its own way, and however many decades from now when this survives and these DCPs are all in the garbage.
Yeah, I mean, like that in and of itself it was crucial for me. It's like I don't think you can make an archival film that isn't as much a record of the present as it is the past. Like, one of the things I find fascinating about archival work and appropriative film work is the way it is always a reflection of the circumstances in which it was made. So you watch some of the kind of early found footage films by artists who've made work like this, and sometimes they're clearly taped off the TV, or they're clearly filmed on 16mm from a projection, and so you're getting the story both of the original material, but also the context in which it was seen.
So the print itself too, it's a one of a kind. There's no preservation elements. It's from our friends in CBC London who they've made work for us. They did our computer chess print. I don't know if anyone was here to see that. It's its own totally inexplicable and beautiful object. But it's a technology that hasn't existed for too long to be able to make a film without a negative. There's also enabling work like this, which would be it would be prohibitively expensive, basically, I'm guessing, to make an inner negative for this film and shell out however many tens of thousands of dollars to go through the whole process of doing a film out that way. So, I don't, without getting too granular, did you have any like comments or anything that you would want to say about going from video to film, and if you experienced any challenges with that? I know this is your first film print. I don't know, it's a weird thing dealing with film labs. So.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing was an enormous learning curve for me. I initially, looked into. I didn't know about film out, the process by which this print was made, where there's no, you just go from a digital file to a print. And so I initially looked into the costs of sort of making it into negative and then getting a print made, and as you say, it runs into the tens of thousands of dollars. I was already pessimistic about the prospect of getting any funding for this film, and lo and behold, I wasn't able to. So this film was made over the course of several years in the evenings and at weekends while I was working on paid work. And so ultimately, if that had been the only avenue, I'm sure it would never have been feasible. But once I found out that there was this process that can make a projection print for closer to $1,000, yeah, suddenly this idea that had been percolating away in my head for so long became plausible. And yeah, I mean, it's beyond that, there were 1,000 questions to be answered and problems to be worked through that I was initially completely ignorant of. And I had to ask a lot of people to help me through it. But yeah, it's one of the things that I've always found stimulating about working with often very little money, is you have to do so much of it yourself, and you learn so much about everything that happens on either side of the filmmaking process, which for me totally informs the filmmaking process. I mean, even just like this stage of things where I'm now touring the print around, like, needless to say, distributors are not particularly interested in buying a film that only exists as one print, that is basically uncommodifiable and can never make money. So I'm handling all of the distribution and exhibition myself, and it's time consuming and labor intensive, but you learn so much about how the whole process of cinema and audiences and how all the pieces fit together, really, which I've always found to be as crucial as the filmmaking process.
Sure. So this is, I think, like the